Inevitably, there arose a conflict between the two species, and in the mind of every individual of either species. It was at the height of this conflict, and in the spiritual crisis in virtue of which these beings were accessible to us in our novitiate stage, that we first entered this world. The Ichthyoids had not yet succumbed biologically to their inferior position, but psychologically they were already showing signs of a deep mental decay. A profound disheartenment and lassitude attacked them, like that which so often undermines our primitive races when they find themselves struggling in the flood of European civilization. But, since in the case of the symbiotics the relation between the two races was extremely intimate, far more so than between the most intimate human beings, the plight of the Ichthyoids deeply affected the Arachnoids, and in the minds of the Ichthyoids the triumph of their partners was for long a source of mingled distress and exaltation. Every individual of both species was torn between conflicting motives. While every healthy Arachnoid longed to take part in the adventurous new life, he or she longed also, through sheer affection and symbiotic entanglement, to assist his or her Ichthyoid mate to have an equal share in that life. Further, all Arachnoids were aware of subtle dependence on their mates, a dependence at once physiological and psychological. It was the Ichthyoids who mostly contributed to the mental symbiosis the power of self-knowledge and mutual insight, and the contemplation which is so necessary to keep actions sweet and sane. That this was so evident from the fact that already, among the Arachnoids, internecine strife had appeared. Island tended to compete with island, and one great industrial organization with another. I could not help remarking that if this deep cleavage of interests had occurred on my own planet, say between our two sexes, the favored sex would have single-mindedly trampled the other into servitude. Such a victory on the part of the Arachnoids did nearly occur. More and more partnerships were dissolved, each member attempting by means of drugs to supply his or her system with the chemicals normally provided by the symbiosis. For mental dependence, however, there was no substitute, and the divorced partners were subject to serious mental disorders, either subtle or flagrant. Nevertheless, there grew up a large population capable of living after a fashion without the symbiotic intercourse. Strife now took a violent turn. The intransigence of both species attacked one another, and stirred up trouble among the moderates. There followed a period of desperate and confused warfare. On each side, a small and hated minority advocated a modernized symbiosis in which each species should be able to contribute to the common life even in a mechanized civilization. Many of these reformers were martyred for their faith. Victory would in the long run have gone to the Arachnoids, for they controlled the sources of power, but it soon appeared that the attempt to break the symbiotic bond was not as successful as it had seemed. Even in actual warfare, commanders were unable to prevent widespread fraternization between the opposed forces. Members of dissolved partnerships would furtively meet to snatch a few hours or moments of each other's company. Widowed or deserted individuals of each species would timidly but hungrily venture toward the enemy's camps in search of new mates. Whole companies would surrender for the same purpose. The Arachnoids suffered more from the neuroses than from the weapons of the enemy. On the islands, moreover, civil wars and social revolutions made the manufacture of munitions almost impossible. The most resolute faction of the Arachnoids now attempted to bring the struggle to an end by poisoning the ocean. The islands, in turn, were poisoned by the millions of decaying corpses that rose to the sea's surface and were cast up upon the shores. Poison, plague, and above all neurosis brought war to a standstill, civilization to ruin, and the two species almost to extinction. The deserted skyscrapers that crowded the islands began to crumble into heaps of wreckage. The submarine cities were invaded by the submarine jungle and by shark-like subhuman ichthyoids of many species. The delicate tissue of knowledge began to disintegrate into fragments of superstition. Now at last came the opportunity of those who advocated a modernized symbiosis. With difficulty they had maintained a secret existence and their individual partnerships in the more remote and inhospitable regions of the planet. They now came boldly forth to spread their gospel among the unhappy remnants of the world's population. There was a range of interspecific mating and remating. Primitive submarine agriculture and hunting maintained the scattered peoples, while a few of the coral cities were cleared and rebuilt, and the instruments of a lean but hopeful civilization were refashioned. This was a temporary civilization without mechanical power, but one which promised itself great adventures in the upper world as soon as it had established the basic principles of the reformed symbiosis. To us it seemed that such an enterprise was doomed to failure, so clear was it that the future lay with a terrestrial rather than a marine creature. But we were mistaken. I must not tell in detail of the heroic struggle by which the race refashioned its symbiotic nature to suit the career that lay before it. The first stage was the reinstatement of power stations on the islands, and the careful reorganization of a purely submarine society equipped with power. But this reconstruction would have been useless had it not been accompanied by a very careful study of the physical and mental relations of the two species. The symbiosis had to be strengthened so that interspecific strife should in future be impossible. By means of chemical treatment in infancy, the two kinds of organism were made more interdependent, and in partnership more hardy. By a special psychological ritual, a sort of mutual hypnosis, all newly joined partners were henceforth brought into indissoluble mental reciprocity. The interspecific communion, which every individual knew in immediate domestic experience, became in time the basic experience of all culture and religion. The symbiotic deity, which figured in all the primitive mythologies, was reinstated as a symbol of the dual personality of the universe, a dualism, it was said, of creativity and wisdom, unified as the divine spirit of love. The one reasonable goal of social life was affirmed to be the creation of a world of awakened, sensitive, intelligent, and mutually understanding personalities, banded together for the common purpose of exploring the universe and developing the human spirit's manifold potentialities. Imperceptibly, the young were led to discover for themselves this goal. Gradually and very cautiously, all the industrial operations and scientific researches of an earlier age were repeated, but with a difference. Industry was subordinated to the conscious social goal. Science, formerly the slave of industry, became the free colleague of wisdom. Once more the islands were crowded with buildings and with eager arachnoid workers, but all the shallow coastal waters were filled with a vast honeycomb of dwelling houses, where the symbiotic partners took rest and refreshment with their mates. In the ocean depths, the old cities were turned into schools, universities, museums, temples, palaces of art and of pleasure. There the young of both kinds grew up together. There the full-grown of both species met constantly for recreation and stimulation. There, while the arachnoids were busy on the islands, the ichthyoids performed their work of education and of refashioning the whole theoretical culture of the world. For it was known clearly by now that in this field their temperament and talents could make a vital contribution to the common life. Thus literature, philosophy, and non-scientific education were carried out chiefly in the ocean, while on the islands industry, scientific inquiry, and the plastic arts were more prominent. Perhaps in spite of the close union of each couple, this strange division of labor would have led in time to renewed conflict had it not been for two new discoveries. One was the development of telepathy. Several centuries after the Age of War, it was found possible to establish full telepathic intercourse between the two members of each couple. In time, this intercourse was extended to include the whole dual race. The first result of this change was a great increase in the facility of communication between individuals all over the world, and therewith a great increase in mutual understanding and in unity of social purpose. But before we lost touch with this rapidly advancing race, we had evidence of a much more far-reaching effect of universal telepathy. Sometimes, so we were told, telepathic communion of the whole race caused something like the fragmentary awakening of a communal world mind in which all individuals participated. The second great innovation of the race was due to genetic research. The arachnoids, who had to remain capable of active life on dry land and on a massive planet, could not achieve any great improvement of brain weight and complexity, but the ichthyoids, who were already large and were buoyed up by the water, were not subject to this limitation. After long and often disastrous experiment, a race of super-ichthyoids was produced. In time, the whole ichthyoid population came to consist of these creatures. Meanwhile, the arachnoids, who were by now exploring and colonizing other planets of their solar system, were genetically improved not in respect of general brain complexity, but in those special brain centers which afforded telepathic intercourse. Thus, in spite of their simpler brain structure, they were able to maintain full telepathic community, even with their big-brained mates far away in the oceans of the mother planet. The The simple brains and the complex brains formed now a single system in which each unit, however simple its own contribution, was sensitive to the whole. It was at this point, when the original ichthyoid race had given place to the super ichthyoids, that we finally lost touch. The experience of the dual race passed completely beyond our comprehension. At a much later stage of our adventure we came upon them again, and on a higher plane of being. They were by then already engaged in the vast common enterprise which, as I shall tell, was undertaken by the Galactic Society of Worlds. At this time the symbiotic race consisted of an immense host of arachnoid adventurers scattered over many planets, and a company of some 50,000 million super ichthyoids living a life of natatory delight and intense mental activity in the ocean of their great native world. Even at this stage, physical contact between the symbiotic partners had to be maintained, though at long intervals. There was a constant stream of spaceships between the colonies and the mother world. The ichthyoids, together with their teaming colleagues on a score of planets, supported a racial mind. Though the threads of the common experience were spun by the whole symbiotic race, they were woven into a single web by the ichthyoids alone in their primeval oceanic home, to be shared by all members of both races.